Passive voice is something that creates problems for a lot of writers, either because they don't understand what it is or they just simply overuse it. And today I want to talk about passive voice. I want to explain what it is, how you can correct it, and I also want to talk about certain scenarios where passive voice can actually improve your writing. By the way, my name is Brandon McNulty. I'm a writer. I'm the author of Bad Parts, also the author of Entry Wounds, and welcome to my writing channel. The best way to understand passive voice is by understanding the difference between passive voice and active voice, because these two things, they go hand in hand and you really can't understand one without knowing the other. So we'll start off, we'll talk about active voice, and the thing about active voice is straight to the point. It's the simplest way to write a sentence because you start with the subject and the subject is then followed by the verb. And then you have the object after the verb. So, for example, if we were going to write a sentence like, Brandon teaches writers, that would be an example of active voice because Brandon is the subject of that sentence. The subject is the person or thing performing the action. And then the act, of course, is the verb, and teaches in this case is the verb, and then the object is what is being acted upon. And in this case, it's writers. So Brandon, the subject, teaches writers. That is an active voice sentence because the subject comes before the verb and performs the action upon the object, which is behind the verb. Now, for passive voice, everything gets flipped around. Instead of the subject coming before the verb, the subject comes after the verb. And then the object gets moved to the front of the sentence before the verb. So if we're going to rewrite that sentence I just gave you in the passive voice, we would say, writers are taught by Brandon. Now, if you notice, the passive voice version of this sentence is longer and it's backwards. And that can cause some confusion for your readers. It can slow the story down. And that's often why you hear people saying, don't use passive voice in your writing. And it's pretty good advice for the most part. If you are struggling with passive voice and you use it a lot in your writing, one thing I'd highly recommend is to go back through your manuscript or go back through your essay or your story or whatever you're writing and find all the different examples of passive voice in your writing. You'll notice it when you see was or were right before a verb. If you see these things in your writing, it's an easy fix to switch it from passive voice to active voice. All you do is you just switch the sentence around. Find the verb, then find the subject and move the subject to the beginning of the sentence. Now, that being said, sometimes it is acceptable to use passive voice. In fact, sometimes it's actually beneficial to your writing. And I'm going to give you 3 specific times when you can use passive voice in your writing and get away with it. Now, the first time is when you don't want to include the subject in your sentence. You might want to cut out the subject for a variety of reasons. For instance, sometimes you want to hide the subject's identity. If we were writing a murder mystery and we had the detective stumbling upon a crime scene, and they find a dead body, they find a victim, and you might write a sentence that hides who the killer is. You might write a sentence like, the body was dismembered, period. You wouldn't include the person or thing that performed the action of dismembering the body. You would just leave that out for now because you're saving that for a big revelation at the end of your story. Another example would be when the subject is unnecessary to the sentence. Maybe you're writing a scenario where you're describing a village on a mountaintop and you want to give a little history of the village, some world building. And you might start a paragraph by saying, the village was built upon a mountain. Period. And you wouldn't say who built the village because maybe that's not important. Maybe it doesn't matter who the actual people were, what their names were. All that matters was that it was built upon a mountain. And then the third example when you might cut the subject out is when the subject is unseen. If you're writing a scene from the point of view of a character who is in a dark room, or maybe they're attacked from behind, or they can't see what is being done to them, you might want to leave out the subject. So, for instance, you might write a sentence like, I was struck from behind. If you don't know who or what struck you, you can't say who or what did the striking. So you would leave out the subject of that sentence. And in this case, you could actually add suspense to your story. I was struck from behind. When the reader sees that sentence, they're wondering, well, what was he struck from behind by, or who struck him? I need to read and find out. So this is a great way to keep your story moving and to keep your readers invested. Now, the second time when passive voice is acceptable is when your point of view character is being acted upon by an opponent. Sometimes you might be writing like a fight scene or a pursuit scene or any other scene where you really want to keep us grounded in that point of view character, and you want to keep them as the focus of the sentences even if they are the ones being acted upon. Some examples of this, like if you're writing an action scene, maybe like a lightsaber battle, and you say something like, Luke was shoved aside by Darth Vader. If you really want to keep us grounded in Luke and where he is and what he's facing in terms of like physical danger and things like that, you would say, Luke was shoved aside by Darth Vader. And then I'll give you one more example. We'll say, Indiana Jones was betrayed by his companion. So in this example, we keep Indiana Jones as the focus of this sentence, even though he's not the subject, he's the focus of this sentence, and that betrayal really hits him hard. We don't even really necessarily care who is doing the betrayal. It's the fact that our focal character, Indiana Jones, is absorbing this betrayal, he's enduring it. That's what matters. And then the third and final time when passive voice is acceptable is when it improves your writing's clarity, pacing, or variety. And believe it or not, passive voice can make your writing stronger. So let's go with an example that focuses on how passive voice can improve clarity. And we'll start off by giving two active voice sentences. George Lucas created Indiana Jones. He grew up loving B movies. Now, these two sentences back to back can create a little confusion for the reader, especially if you don't know who George Lucas is. He can refer to either Indiana Jones or George Lucas. And the fact that he is right next to Indiana Jones might tempt you to think that, okay, maybe Indiana Jones grew up loving B movies. There's definitely some confusion here between the proper nouns and the pronouns. So a way that we can add a little clarity here is by using passive voice in that first sentence. And we'll rewrite it and we'll say, Indiana Jones was created by George Lucas. He grew up loving B movies. Now it's clear. Now we get to see George Lucas right next to the pronoun he, and there's a short jump between Lucas and he, so it's clear that he, George Lucas, grew up loving B movies. And if we want to take the extra step and we want to make it totally clear, we can say Indiana Jones was created by George Lucas, who grew up loving B movies. Now let's look at how passive voice can improve pacing and variety. I'm going to give you an example that is 3 sentences long. They're all going to be active voice at first, and then I'm going to show you how passive voice can improve them. Indiana Jones approached the golden idol. The nearby traps confused him. Then a solution struck him. So these 3 active voice sentences are moving pretty quick, and I think they're moving too fast, especially that second sentence, because when a person is confused, usually they're not moving quickly or they're not thinking quickly. Usually when they're confused, they're trying to puzzle out what's going on, or they're trying to make sense of the scenario that they're facing. So what I would do, I would take that second sentence and I would use passive voice strategically here. I would use passive voice to slow down the sentence because remember, when we use passive voice, we're adding extra words. So we'll slow down the pacing and we'll also make it a little more confusing by pushing the subject toward the back of the sentence. And what this is going to do, it's going to convey a sense of confusion for the reader. It's going to make them stop for a little bit and think as they're reading. So here's the rewrite. Indiana Jones approached the golden idol. He was confused by the nearby traps. Then a solution struck him. This version is much stronger than the first one because of that second sentence. And the sentence is longer, which stretches things out a little bit. It slows down the pacing. It conveys a sense that, okay, we're taking time to make sense of our situation. And then in our final sentence, we have an active voice sentence that's right to the point, and he's instantly struck by that solution. So again, this is somewhat of an advanced technique, but it is something to keep in mind as you're editing your stories, as you're asking yourself, what happens if I manipulate the pacing here? Can I make my story stronger by slowing things down? Or by creating maybe a little minor confusion here and there? So I hope this helps. Question of the day, be honest, how often do you use passive voice? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to support the channel, please pick up a copy of either one of my novels. Also, be sure to check out my other videos. Hit the like and subscribe buttons for me. Share this video with a friend. And as always, remember to keep on writing.